It was past midnight when Tonia Brooks finally pushed through the heavy door of Chicago General Hospital and stepped out into the storm. The wind hit her immediately, sharp and merciless, cutting straight through her thick winter coat like it had a personal grudge. She had been on her feet for 14 hours. 14 hours of beeping monitors, coded patients, grieving families, and the kind of emotional weight that never quite leaves your shoulders no matter how many times you shrug. She was tired in a way that sleep could not immediately fix. She was tired in her bones. But Tonia walked. She always walked the 6 blocks home when the weather allowed, and even when it did not, because she had long believed that the cold air helped her decompress. It forced her to be present. It forced her to breathe. Tonight, though, the city had other plans. The snow was coming down in thick, swirling sheets, and the sidewalks had gone mostly empty, the kind of empty that makes a city feel like it belongs to a different world entirely. She was 2 blocks from home when she saw him. He was slumped against the stone wall of a closed pharmacy, half buried in a drift of snow, his long dark coat soaked straight through and frozen stiff at the hem. His head was bowed. His gloved hands had gone limp at his sides. Most people would have kept walking. Most people would have assumed he was sleeping or intoxicated, or simply someone else's problem. But Tonia Brooks was not most people, and her eyes, the eyes of a nurse who had spent a decade reading bodies the way others read books, told her immediately that this man was not sleeping. He was shutting down. She dropped to her knees beside him without a second thought, pressing 2 fingers to the side of his neck. His pulse was there, but slow and thread-thin, dragging itself along like it was exhausted from the effort. His lips had gone faintly blue. His skin, when she pressed the back of her hand to his cheek, felt like touching marble left out in winter, cold in a way that went far beyond surface temperature. This was advanced hypothermia. She had seen it before. She knew exactly what it looked like, and she knew exactly what it meant if she did nothing. She did not hesitate. Tonia got her shoulder under his arm, gripped his wrist with both hands, and used every ounce of her years of patient lifting strength to haul him upright.
Stay with me. Just a few more steps, okay? We are almost safe.
He was tall, much taller than she had expected, broad-shouldered and heavy with the dead weight of a man whose body had already started conserving its last resources. She staggered. She planted her feet. She held on. "I've got you," she said to herself as much as to him. "Come on. I've got you." She half carried him, half dragged him those last 2 blocks through the howling storm, talking to him the entire way, soft, steady, and calm, the way she talked to patients who were frightened and lost in the fog of a medical crisis. She did not know his name. She did not know where he had come from or why he had been out in a storm like this. None of that mattered. What mattered was getting him warm. She got him through her building's front door. She got him into the elevator. She got him into her apartment, and only then, only once the door was shut and the heat was surrounding them both, did she allow herself one long, shaking breath. She went to work. What Tonia Brooks did not know, what she could not possibly have known, standing in her small warm apartment at midnight, was that the unconscious man she was stripping of frozen clothing and wrapping in every blanket she owned was one of the most powerful and protected men in the entire city of Chicago. A man whose name alone was enough to make entire boardrooms go quiet. A man who had spent his adult life surrounded by walls, real walls, professional walls, emotional walls built so high that no light had reached the inside of them in years. His name was Kang Seo-jun. And in all of his 36 years on this earth, not one single person had ever done for him what this stranger did on a snowy Tuesday night in January. By morning he would be a different man. By morning he would be obsessed, not in darkness, not in possession, but in the quiet, unshakable way of a person who has finally found something worth protecting with every fiber of his being. This is their story, 9 acts of raw emotion, unexpected warmth, and a quiet obsession that began with 1 act of mercy. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments right now. And tell me honestly, if you saw a stranger freezing to death in a blizzard, would you risk everything to carry them home like Tonia did? Let's see how many of you would do the same. The shift had started before sunrise and ended long past dark, the way most of Tonia's shifts did in January, when the cold drove people into emergency rooms with chest pains, broken bones from icy falls, and hypothermia from sleeping in places that were never meant to shelter a human body through a Chicago winter. She had held a woman's hand while her husband of 42 years was pronounced dead 2 rooms over. She had sung quietly to a 5-year-old boy during a blood draw, making up nonsense lyrics about brave superheroes until he laughed through his tears. She had stayed 20 minutes past the end of her shift to explain discharge instructions to an elderly man whose English was limited and whose face had held such complete confusion that leaving him without clarity had simply not been an option. That was Tonia Brooks. That was the whole of her, distilled into a single working day. By the time she stepped out of Chicago General and into the night, she was carrying all of it. The woman's grief, the little boy's fear, the old man's confusion. The way she always did, not because she lacked boundaries, but because she had decided long ago that caring fully was the only kind of caring worth doing. Her late mother had taught her that. Her grandmother had reinforced it with a lifetime of quiet, steadfast example. She pulled her grandmother's knitted hat down over her thick coils and started walking. The storm had worsened since she had last looked out a hospital window. The snow was no longer falling so much as flying, driven sideways by a wind that had clearly decided it had somewhere important to be. The streets were nearly empty. The few souls still outside were moving quickly, heads down, shoulders hunched against the cold. The city at this hour felt stripped of its usual noise, reduced to the muffled hush of snowfall and the distant, lonely wail of a siren several blocks away. Tonia did not mind the quiet. In fact, she needed it. She walked the way she always walked, with purpose, her scrub pants tucked into her boots, her nursing bag across one shoulder, her breath making small white clouds in the frigid air. She was 2.5 blocks from her building when she noticed the dark shape against the pharmacy wall. At first, her tired brain tried to rationalize it. A bag of garbage. A pile of wet cardboard. Someone's abandoned coat. But her feet slowed before her mind fully caught up, because something in her, the part that had been trained for years to notice what other people dismissed, pulled at her like a hand on her sleeve. She stopped. She looked. The shape was a man. He was seated against the stone wall with his knees slightly bent and his head dropped forward toward his chest, the way a body goes when it is no longer making conscious decisions about posture. His coat was a deep charcoal gray, beautifully tailored even beneath its coating of ice and snow, the kind of coat that belonged in a different neighborhood entirely, in a different kind of night. His dark hair was dusted white with snow. His hands were in gloves, leather, expensive, but the leather was soaked through, and even from where she stood, Tonia could see that his fingers were not moving. She crossed to him in 4 steps and crouched down. "Sir." She placed her hand firmly on his shoulder. "Sir, can you hear me?" Nothing. Not even a flinch. She pressed her fingers to his neck just below his jaw. The pulse was there, slow, weak, and irregular in a way that sent a cold spike of alarm straight through her chest. She pulled off her glove and pressed the back of her bare hand to his cheek. The cold that met her skin was alarming. It was the deep, settled cold of someone who had been out in this storm for far longer than a few minutes. His core temperature was dropping. His body was already in the process of shutting down unnecessary systems, redirecting whatever warmth it had left toward the organs that needed it most. She had seen this progression before, and she knew exactly where it led if nothing was done. "Okay," she said softly, mostly to herself. "Okay. I've got you." She did not call an ambulance. She thought about it, for approximately 2 seconds, and then she thought about the wait time on a night like this, in a storm like this, when every available unit in the city was already stretched. She thought about standing out here in the cold waiting for help to arrive while this man's pulse continued its slow fade. She thought about her apartment, 140 steps away by her own estimation. She thought about her grandmother's voice saying what it had always said, that the right thing and the easy thing were almost never the same thing, and that the mark of a person's character was which one they chose when the choice was hard. Tonia Brooks chose the right thing. She always did. She got his arm over her shoulder. She gripped his wrist. She braced her legs the way she had learned to do when transferring patients who could not transfer themselves. Weight low, core engaged, lift with her whole body, not just her back. He was heavy. He was very heavy. But Tonia had been lifting patients for a decade, and she had a kind of quiet physical strength that people often underestimated because she carried it without making any noise about it. She got him up. He groaned, low, barely audible, and his head lolled to one side, but his legs, responding to some deep, instinctive signal, made a shuffling attempt to hold weight. It was not much, but it was enough to help. "That's it," she said, steadying them both. "That's it. Keep going. Come on. I've got you. I promise I've got you." She talked the entire way. It was habit, born from years of guiding frightened patients through procedures they did not understand, through pain they could not articulate, through fear they could not name. She talked because she knew that the human voice, calm, warm, and present, was its own kind of medicine. She told him he was going to be fine. She told him she was a nurse and she knew what she was doing. She told him her name even though she doubted he could hear her. She told him that her apartment was close, that there was heat, that everything was going to be all right. She meant every word. Getting through the building's front door was a study in determination. The heavy glass door fought against the wind, and Tonia fought back, shouldering it open with the side of her body while keeping her grip on the man steady. The elevator was blessedly waiting. She got them both inside. She pressed her floor number with her elbow. She watched their reflection in the elevator's mirrored wall, herself flushed and breathing hard, her hat askew, her knitting still somehow intact over her coils, and him pale and still, his head resting against her shoulder as though he had surrendered to the one person his instincts had decided to trust. Her apartment was warm. She had left the heat on that morning, a habit from childhood, from years of returning to her late mother's small apartment where the warmth waiting behind the door had always felt like being held. She deposited the man carefully onto her couch, arranging him so that he would not roll, and immediately went into the focused, efficient mode that 14 years of emergency nursing had carved into her muscle memory. She stripped his coat, the jacket beneath it, his shoes and socks which were soaked straight through. She worked quickly and without sentiment, keeping her mind on the clinical reality of what needed to happen and setting aside everything else. She layered him in blankets, every blanket she owned pulled from the closet shelf, and tucked them around him with the same care she used for patients in her hospital's warming protocols. Then she went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. While the water heated, she prepared warm compresses from hand towels soaked in water that was warm but not hot, because she knew that heat applied too quickly to hypothermic skin could cause complications that the situation did not need. She pressed the compresses gently to his neck, his armpits, his wrists, the places where the body's major arteries ran closest to the surface, where warmth could be delivered most efficiently to the blood. She checked his pulse every few minutes. Slowly, so slowly, it began to strengthen. The kettle sang. She made tea, added honey, and held the mug near his face so that the warm steam could reach him, talking to him softly all the while. The radiator in the corner of her living room clanked and hissed in its familiar, comforting rhythm. The storm pressed itself against the windows, but it could not get in here. Nothing cold could get in here tonight. She thought of her grandmother then, a woman who had grown up in Mississippi and carried herself through 60 years of a life that had not been gentle with the kind of quiet, immovable grace that Tonia had spent her whole life trying to learn. Her grandmother had taken in strays, cats, people, stories, with the same matter-of-fact warmth, as though turning away need had simply never occurred to her as an option. She had died when Tonia was 24 in a hospital room not unlike the ones Tonia now worked in, and she had died the way she had lived, with her hand in someone else's, making sure the other person felt less alone. That was the promise Tonia had made, standing in that hospital room. She had looked at her grandmother's face, peaceful and still, and she had made a promise to that room, to whatever listened to promises made in grief, that no one in her presence would ever feel alone in their pain. Not ever. Not if she could help it. She looked at the stranger on her couch, the sharp, handsome lines of his face, the dark lashes against his pale cheek, the slow and steadying rise and fall of his chest, and she felt that promise settle around her shoulders like a second coat. "You're safe now," she whispered, pressing another warm compress gently to his wrist. "I've got you." The storm was still going at 2 in the morning, making its presence known against the windows in long shuddering gusts that rattled the glass and sent snow in spiraling patterns against the pane. Inside, the apartment was quiet in the way that only truly warm spaces can be quiet. A deep, cocoon-like stillness broken only by the radiator's soft percussion and the occasional creak of the building settling around them. Tonia sat in the armchair she had pulled close to the couch, wrapped in the oversized university hoodie she had changed into after her shift clothes were traded for something dry. She had a cup of chamomile tea on the small table beside her, long since gone cold, forgotten in the focus of monitoring her patient. She was watching the rise and fall of his chest with the trained attention of someone who had learned not to trust stillness too completely. She checked his temperature every 20 minutes with the small digital thermometer she kept in her nursing bag. It had been dangerously low when she first got it under his tongue, low enough to confirm what her hands had already told her. But now, 2 hours in, it was climbing steadily. His color had returned from the alarming blue-gray of true hypothermia to something closer to the natural warmth of living skin. His breathing had deepened and slowed into the even rhythm of genuine sleep rather than unconsciousness. She allowed herself to exhale. She studied him in the way that only being alone with a sleeping person permits, unhurried and honest. He was extraordinarily handsome in the kind of way that seemed almost architectural, all sharp angles and precise features, the kind of face that looked like it had been designed with intention. His jaw was strong and clean-shaven. His dark brows were slightly furrowed even in sleep, as though even his unconscious mind was accustomed to carrying weight. His black hair had dried in loose disarray across his forehead, and without the stiffness of his frozen coat around him, he looked younger. He looked almost soft. He looked, she thought, profoundly and privately exhausted. She wondered about him, the way she wondered about patients when their charts told her what had happened to their bodies but nothing about who they were before the crisis. She wondered where he had been going or coming from. She wondered who would be looking for him. She wondered whether someone was awake right now in some other part of the city, waiting for this man to come through a door that he had not come through. She got up quietly, took the cold teacup to the kitchen, rinsed it, and made herself a fresh cup. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the storm for a moment, pressing the warm mug between both palms. The city beyond her glass was a study in white and shadow, the streetlights burning orange through the curtain of falling snow, the parked cars reduced to smooth, anonymous mounds. The world had gone temporarily soft. She went back to her chair. At some point past 3 in the morning she must have dozed because she was jolted awake by movement, a sharp intake of breath, the creak of the couch cushions shifting. She was on her feet immediately, the way she had learned to wake in the years she spent caring for her mother in the months before she passed. From sleep to full alertness in the space of a single heartbeat, every sense turned forward. He was awake. He was sitting partially upright, the blankets pooled around his waist, one hand braced on the armrest of the couch and the other pressed flat to his own chest as though he was checking to confirm he was real. His dark eyes were open and moving rapidly around the room, the bookshelves crowded with nursing textbooks and novels, the framed print of a Harlem Renaissance painting above the television, the small string of warm lights along the windowsill that Tonia kept on year-round because she liked the way they felt, the kitchen just beyond the counter. His gaze traveled and finally stopped when it reached her. They looked at each other. His eyes were extraordinary, very dark brown, almost black in the low light, and there was something in them that she could not immediately name. It was not fear, though confusion was there. It was not hostility. It was something closer to the expression she sometimes saw on patients who had just come back from somewhere very far away and were still calibrating the distance between where they had been and where they were now. "Hey," Tonia said softly, keeping her voice at the same pitch she used when approaching a patient she didn't want to startle. "Hey, easy. You're okay. You're safe." He blinked. His hand dropped slowly from his chest. "Where?" His voice was low and slightly raw, roughened by cold and sleep, and he stopped, pressed his lips together, and tried again. "Where am I?" "My apartment," she said simply, coming to stand at the edge of the coffee table so he did not have to strain to see her. "My name is Tonia Brooks. I'm a nurse. I found you outside, on Millard Avenue against the pharmacy wall. You were in hypothermia. I brought you here." He absorbed this with a stillness that she found unusual. Most people, waking in an unfamiliar place with no memory of how they got there, reacted with immediate panic, sitting up sharply, reaching for a phone, demanding to know exactly what had happened and who was responsible for the gap in their memory. This man sat with the information, turned it over, and looked at her with an expression that was slowly shifting from confusion to something she had no easy category for. "You carried me," he said. It was not a question. "More or less," she said and smiled, the warm, unassuming smile that her colleagues joked could calm a panic attack at 30 paces. "You helped a little. Your legs still remembered what to do even if the rest of you had checked out." Something moved across his face. The faintest shadow of something she thought might eventually become an expression. Not quite a smile, but a response in the same direction. "Kang Seo-jun," he said quietly. "That is my name." "Tonia," she said again in case the first time had not fully registered through the fog of recovery. She sat back down in the armchair, tucking her feet beneath her the way she did when she was settling in for the long kind of sitting. "How do you feel? Any pain? Numbness in your hands or feet?" He looked down at his hands, bare now, his gloves set on the coffee table where she had placed them to dry. He flexed his fingers slowly, one by one, testing. "They feel as if they are waking from a very long sleep," he said. "That's normal," she told him. "The circulation coming back. It might tingle for a bit. That's a good sign." She stood again because sitting still was difficult when there was something to do, and went to the kitchen to reheat the tea she had prepared earlier. "I'm going to get you something warm to drink. Are you allergic to anything, honey?" "No," he said, and she heard the quiet bewilderment in that single syllable, the faint incredulity of a man encountering something that did not fit any framework he currently possessed. She came back with the tea, handed it to him, and watched him take it with both hands, the way you hold something you suddenly understand the value of. He sipped slowly. His eyes closed briefly as the warmth moved through him, and when they opened again, he looked at her with an expression that made Tonia feel, for a moment, that she was being seen in some very specific and careful way. "You do not know me," he said. "No," she agreed. "And yet you—" He paused, seeming to search for the right configuration of words, and she had the impression that this man was very precise with language when he chose to use it, and very selective about when he chose to use it at all. "You brought me into your home. You needed to come into someone's home," she said simply. "It might as well have been mine." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked down at the tea in his hands, and she watched something shift in the architecture of his face, some very old tension she had not even noticed until it began, almost imperceptibly, to loosen. "Thank you," he said. And the way he said it, quietly, without embellishment, with the weight of someone who did not say those words easily or often, landed in the room like something placed down carefully rather than spoken. Tonia nodded, easy and warm. "Get some more rest," she said. "I'll be right here." By 4 in the morning, the storm had begun to lose its conviction. The wind dropped from a howl to a low, intermittent moan, and the snow, still falling but gently now, came down in the quiet, unhurried way of something that had said everything it needed to say and was simply trailing off. Tonia had turned on the small lamp in the corner of the room, the one with the warm amber shade, because the string lights alone felt insufficient for actual conversation, and conversation had, slowly, inevitably begun. It started with her asking him simple questions. Did he feel nauseous? Did the tingling in his extremities concern him? Had he any history of heart conditions? Clinical questions, the professional scaffolding of care. He answered each one briefly, with the precision of someone accustomed to providing information without elaborating beyond what was specifically requested. But then she asked, "Can I get you anything else?" And he had said after a pause, "Would you talk? Not about medicine. Just talk." She had looked at him, at the careful blankness of his face, the way he held it neutral even while making this surprisingly unguarded request, and she had understood something without being able to fully explain what. She had understood that this man was not accustomed to asking for things that were not strictly necessary. That asking for the sound of another person's voice was, for him, a significant departure from whatever rules he normally lived by. So she talked. She told him about the shift she had just come off, not the sad parts but the funny ones. The elderly man who had complained loudly that the hospital food was worse than what he fed his dog, and then quietly confessed that he fed his dog very well. The little boy who had made her sing 3 verses of an improvised superhero song before he consented to having his blood drawn. The colleague who had accidentally worn 2 different shoes to work and only noticed at hour 11. Seo-jun listened. He did not interject or redirect. He simply listened, with the focused stillness of a man who had learned to process information very carefully, and Tonia noticed, because she was practiced at noticing things, that as she talked, his hands relaxed around the mug. The furrow between his brows, which she was beginning to understand might be a permanent feature of his resting expression, eased slightly. She told him about her neighborhood. About growing up on the south side in a small apartment where her mother had kept the windows full of plants because she said living things needed other living things around them. About learning to cook in that apartment, not gourmet cooking but the kind of cooking that was an act of love, the kind where you made the recipe your grandmother had taught you and felt her presence in the kitchen even years after she was gone. She told him about the community center 6 blocks from her apartment, where she went on her days off to mentor teenagers who were brilliant and funny and dealing with more than any teenager should have to deal with. She told him about Marcus, who was 17 and wanted to be a doctor and whose standardized test prep she had been helping with on Saturday mornings. She told him about her dreams of one day opening a small free clinic right in the heart of the South Side, a place where people could get real medical care without drowning in bills afterward, because she had watched her mother delay doctors' visits for years because of the cost, and she had promised herself, another promise, she was full of them, that she would spend her life closing that gap wherever she could. She talked, and Seo-jun listened, and the amber lamp held them both in its warm circle while the storm retreated outside, and somewhere in the middle of a story about learning to line dance at her grandmother's church at the age of 7, she glanced over and found him watching her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It was not polite attention. It was not the patient, waiting look of a person enduring someone else's conversation until it was their turn. It was something more open than that, more undefended, like a window that had just been raised an inch after a very long time of being shut. "You dance?" he asked. "In my kitchen mostly," she admitted, grinning. "Old R&B. Like deep old. The kind your parents played at cookouts. If I am having a bad day, I will tell you right now, 15 minutes of Marvin Gaye and I am a completely different person. What does it feel like? He asked. The question surprised her, not because it was strange but because of the way he asked it. Genuinely. Carefully. Like a man putting his hand towards something warm and wanting to understand the nature of the warmth before he allowed himself to fully feel it. Like remembering that you have a body, she said slowly, thinking it through as she spoke, and that the body can do things that have nothing to do with work or responsibility or keeping everything together. Like joy in its most honest form. Just pure, uncomplicated joy. He was quiet for a moment. I have not felt that, he said, in a very long time. It was a spare thing to say. It contained almost nothing, and yet the almost nothing in it was somehow vast, and Tonia heard it the way she heard the things patients said when they were not saying the whole of what they meant. She did not push. She did not probe. She simply let it sit in the room between them, respected and uninterrogated. What do you do? She asked instead. For work, I mean. A careful pause. Business, he said. International. Import-export. The management of complex relationships between people with competing interests. She nodded. She did not press further. There was something in his phrasing, elegant and perfectly designed to convey and conceal in equal measure, that told her he was a man who had learned to answer questions about himself the way a skilled chess player moved a piece, accurately, and with a full awareness of what the move revealed and what it protected. That sounds exhausting, she said simply. He looked at her. It is, he said. And then, after another pause, you are the first person to say so. She asked him what had happened, how he had ended up on Millard Avenue in that storm against that wall, and he told her briefly that he had been walking between two locations nearby, had misjudged the speed at which the temperature was dropping, and had gone down faster than he had anticipated. He said it with the faint, precise discomfort of a man unaccustomed to admitting to miscalculation of any kind. I owe you my life, he said, simply. Without theater. You don't owe me anything, she told him equally simply. This is just what I do. He shook his head once, slowly, as though she had said something he could not fully accept. No, he said. It is not just what you do. You chose this. You could have passed by. Anyone else would have passed by. Then I'm glad I'm not anyone else, she said and smiled. He looked at her then with those dark, quiet eyes, and she felt something shift in the room, something subtle like the pressure change before sunrise. The storm outside had gone almost silent now. The radiator ticked. The lamp burned amber and warm. And Kang Seo-jun, powerful and guarded and lonely in ways he had never thought to name, felt something begin to move inside him that had not moved in years. He did not have a word for it yet. But warmth, he thought. It felt something like warmth. Dawn arrived the way it does after a hard winter night, quietly, and with the pale, clean light of a world that has been washed down to its essentials. The snow had stopped. The city outside Tonia's windows was white and hushed, the early morning streets untracked and new, as though the night had erased everything that had been written on them before and left a fresh page. Tonia was in the kitchen when she heard him moving. She came to the doorway to find Seo-jun standing, fully upright for the first time, beside the couch. He had arranged the blankets in a careful pile at one end, folded, she noticed, with more precision than most houseguests managed. He was wearing the clothes she had put back on him once they were dry, his dress shirt, his trousers, and without the heavy coat, without the ice and the snow, he was simply a very tall, very composed man standing in her small, warm living room looking somehow both out of place and completely right. She did a quick visual assessment out of habit. Color, good. Posture, steady. No signs of residual confusion. He met her eyes when she appeared in the doorway, and in the morning light, she could see the full depth of that dark gaze, calm now and clear, and carrying something she was not sure she had an easy category for. How are you feeling? She asked. Much better, he said. Considerably. He looked around the room once, briefly, as though committing it to memory, and then back at her. I need to make a call. My phone. Table, she said, pointing to the small entry table by the door where she had set it the night before. I put it to charge. It was almost dead. He looked at the phone and then at her, and something crossed his face that she read as being caught off guard by such a small, practical kindness, offered without being asked. He picked up the phone. He made a call, turning slightly away, speaking quietly and in Korean, brief and controlled. When he ended the call and turned back to her, his expression had resettled into that composed authority she had glimpsed even when he was barely conscious, the look of a man who, regardless of circumstance, carried himself as though the ground beneath his feet would hold. Someone is coming, he said. 20 minutes. He paused, and the composure shifted just slightly, a hairline fracture of something more open beneath it. I would ask to stay until they arrive if that is. Stay as long as you need, she said easily. Sit down. I'll make breakfast. She made eggs and toast because it was what she had and because a person recovering from hypothermia needed real food, and because feeding people was, for Tonia, one of the most instinctive expressions of care she knew. She set a plate in front of him at her small kitchen table and sat across from him with her own, and they ate in a silence that was, she noticed, entirely comfortable, the rare kind of silence that did not need to be filled. He ate neatly and thoroughly, with the kind of attention to what was in front of him that suggested a man who had learned not to waste things that were given freely. This is the first home-cooked meal I have eaten, he said eventually, in a very long time. She looked up from her toast. How long? He thought about it. Years, he said. She watched him, this precise and quietly powerful man sitting at her small kitchen table eating scrambled eggs with both hands around his mug like someone rediscovering the basic pleasure of warmth, and she felt something in her chest that she was not immediately going to examine. When the buzzer sounded, his ride downstairs, he stood and went for his coat, which she had hung near the radiator overnight. It was dry now, though still faintly stiff. He put it on, and the transformation was immediate and subtle. He stood a fraction taller, his shoulders settling into something that was not quite armor but was adjacent to it. The coat was who he was in the world. Without it, he was the man who had eaten eggs at her kitchen table and told her he had not tasted warmth in years. With it on, he was something larger. He turned to face her. Tonia Brooks, he said, and the way he said her name, careful, deliberate, like something being written down, made her stand very still. I am aware that no amount of money could repay what you did last night. I will not insult you by offering it. He paused, and for the first time since he had woken, she saw something in his face that looked genuinely unsettled, not by uncertainty but by the weight of sincerity. What I will promise you is this: the world will treat you the way you deserve to be treated. No more walking alone through storms. No more carrying strangers through the cold with no one to carry you. She blinked. That's a very large promise for a man who just met me. Yes, he agreed, and this time there was something at the edges of his mouth, not quite a smile but unmistakably its near neighbor. It is. She laughed, genuine, unguarded, the full and lovely laugh of a woman who found real things funny and was not in the habit of pretending otherwise. I appreciate the thought, she said warmly. I really do. But I'm pretty good at taking care of myself. I know, he said. You took care of me. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a small card. No image, no title. Just a name and a number in clean black ink. May I have yours? She looked at the card, then at him. She was not sure what she was agreeing to exactly. She was not entirely sure he was sure either. But there was nothing in his face that asked for anything except what he had asked for, a number, a way to reach her, and after a moment she crossed to the kitchen counter, wrote her number on the back of a takeout menu, tore that corner off and handed it to him. He held it with both hands briefly, the way he had held the tea the night before. Thank you, he said. Again. With that same specific weight. Don't get caught in any more blizzards, she told him. He inclined his head, a small formal acknowledgement that was somehow also the most graceful thing she had seen anyone do in her kitchen, and then he was at the door and then he was gone. Tonia stood in the middle of her living room for a moment, listening to the quiet that he had left behind. Then she looked out the window. A black SUV was parked at the curb below, long and gleaming even beneath the night's accumulated snow. She watched Seo-jun emerge from her building's front door and move to the vehicle, and she noticed, even from 5 stories up, that the man who opened the door for him moved with the particular alert efficiency of someone whose primary job was paying attention. The door closed. The SUV pulled away. She watched until it turned the corner. Then she put her hands on her hips, looked at the ceiling and said out loud to her empty apartment, "What in the world was that?" The apartment did not answer. But it felt warmer than usual, which was answer enough. He sat in the back of the SUV with his hands flat on his thighs and the city moving past the tinted windows and cold morning light, and he thought about a woman who danced to old R&B in her kitchen. His driver, steady, discreet, professional, said nothing. The man who sat in the front passenger seat said nothing either. This was as Seo-jun preferred it. He did not explain himself to anyone, and those who worked for him understood this completely. But inside the quiet of his own mind, something was happening that was neither quiet nor familiar. He had been, in the 36 years of his life, a man who organized the world into categories of useful and not useful, loyal and not loyal, within his control and outside it. He had learned early that emotion without discipline was a liability, and he had spent a great deal of energy building a life that left as little room for liability as possible. He was not unfeeling. He had simply learned to feel things in controlled doses and within carefully maintained limits. Tonia Brooks was outside every limit he had ever built. He could not stop replaying it. Not just the morning, though the morning kept returning to him, the small kitchen and the eggs in her unguarded laugh, but the night. Her voice in the dark, steady and warm, talking to him as though his life was worth the effort of saving when she did not even know what his life was. Her hands on his wrist, pressing warmth back into him with a focused tenderness that had no agenda. The way she had said, "You're safe now," without a single qualification, without condition, without needing anything from him in return. He had lived surrounded by people his entire adult life, and he had never once felt what he had felt in that apartment. Simply, completely seen. He was not naive about what she was or what he was, or about the considerable gulf between those two things. He was not foolish enough to dress last night in language it did not yet deserve. But he was also, for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, in possession of a feeling that he did not want to put back in the box it had presumably come from. And Kang Seo-jun, whatever else he was a man who trusted his instincts absolutely. His instinct right now was this: her world needed to be protected. The warmth she carried, that extraordinary, specific, inexhaustible warmth, was not something the city had any right to grind down or freeze or wear away over the years of hard shifts and bad weather and long walks home alone in the dark. Someone should be ensuring that it was safe. Someone should be making certain that the sidewalks she walked on were well lit and watched over. That her coat was warm enough for the temperatures she insisted on walking through. That the 6 blocks between her hospital and her home were not surveilled. He was careful in his own mind to choose the right word, simply looked after. By the time the SUV arrived at his building on the northern edge of the city, he had made several decisions. By 8 o'clock that same morning, a car, a reliable sedan, nothing conspicuous, had been discreetly assigned to Tonia's neighborhood, with instructions to maintain a respectful and entirely invisible presence on her regular routes. Not to follow. Not to interfere. Simply to be there, the way a streetlight is there, doing its work without asking to be thanked for it. By 10 o'clock, a grocery delivery had been arranged, specifically selected based on what her kitchen had contained, filling in the gaps he had noticed, supplemented by things she had mentioned enjoying. He had a good memory. He remembered everything she had said. The groceries arrived at her door with a note from an anonymous benefactor wishing her a good week, giving her no indication that this was anything other than a random neighborly kindness, because he was not yet ready to explain himself, and because the kindness was, regardless of explanation, real. By noon, he had arranged for a new coat, warmer than the one she had been wearing, same style and the same dark color so that she would not find it jarring, purchased through an intermediary and left with her building's front desk as a delivery. The card attached said only, "For the nurse who carries strangers through storms. Stay warm this time." He sat at his desk, the wide, clean desk of a man whose work required precision and the management of very many things at once, and found for the first time in years that his mind was not fully on any of it. It was on a small apartment on the south side, warm and amber-lit, where a woman he had known for less than a single night had pressed warmth back into him when the world was trying to take it all away. He picked up his phone and looked at the corner of the takeout menu in his inside breast pocket. Her handwriting, round and sure, the numbers written in the way of someone who had no interest in making her handwriting anything other than clearly legible. He did not text yet. It was too soon, and he understood the importance of pacing, of building something right rather than building it fast. He had spent his entire career understanding that the things most worth having were the things you approached with patience and care. But he put the menu corner back carefully in the same place and he thought, "This is not something I will let go of." It was, he recognized, the beginning of an obsession. He understood obsessions. He had built a career on them, the obsessive attention to detail that kept complex systems running, the obsessive loyalty that made people trust him, the obsessive vigilance that kept him and those he cared for safe. But this obsession was different in its texture. It was not cold or calculating. It was warm. It was the warmth he had absorbed in that apartment, and it had taken up residence in him, and he understood with the complete clarity of a man who had spent a lifetime reading the truth of things, that it had no intention of leaving. That afternoon, he stood at his floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the Chicago skyline, still white at its edges with the morning's snow, and he thought about a woman who had promised herself that no one would ever feel alone in pain on her watch. He thought, someone should make the same promise to her. He decided that someone. 3 weeks passed. On the first morning, Tonia found the groceries. She stood in her doorway staring at the neatly arranged bags for a long moment, checked with the front desk, learned they had been delivered, found no sender information, and spent approximately 45 minutes internally debating whether to be charmed or unsettled before deciding, because she was Tonia Brooks and pragmatism was as much a part of her as compassion, that unused groceries were a waste and she was hungry, and she would deal with the mystery of their origin later. She found the coat the same evening. The note made her stand in the lobby for a moment with the coat in her arms and a strange feeling in her chest that was warm and bewildered and not entirely unpleasant. She texted him. She had kept his card. She was not sure why she had kept his card, and she was not in the habit of examining the reasons for small decisions too closely. She simply found herself that evening sitting on her couch with the card in one hand and her phone in the other, and she typed, "I received some unusual deliveries today. You wouldn't know anything about that." His response came in under 4 minutes, which told her something about where his phone had been. "The coat is warmer. You needed a warmer coat." She stared at the text for a moment. She typed, "You didn't need to do that." He replied, "You said that to me also. Last night. About saving my life. I did not find it convincing then either." She laughed. Out loud, alone in her apartment, she laughed, and the laugh surprised her with how good it felt, how uncomplicated it was, how much it felt like something she wanted to happen again. And so it began. The texts were not constant. He was not the kind of man who flooded anyone's phone with messages, but they were consistent. Every morning, a good morning message that was never merely good morning, but was always something specific and considered. A detail about what was happening in his morning, a thought he had had, occasionally a question. He asked her questions the way he had listened to her in the apartment, with full, unhurried attention. He remembered everything. Every detail she had mentioned. Marcus and the SAT prep, the free clinic dream, the kitchen dancing, her late mother's windowsill plants, was referenced again in later conversations with the precision of a man who had catalogued every word she said because all of it, to him, was worth keeping. She found herself looking forward to his messages in the morning before she got out of bed. She found herself composing responses in her head during particularly slow stretches at the hospital, shaping things she wanted to tell him, anecdotes she thought he would appreciate. She told him about the patient who had spent 20 minutes arguing that his blood pressure was wrong because he felt completely fine, and then had been escorted back to his room with a reading that suggested otherwise. Seo-jun had responded, "He sounds like several people I know." She had replied, "Including yourself?" He had taken a moment longer to answer than usual, and then, "Possibly." They talked on the phone for the first time on a Thursday evening when she had gotten home from the community center and was making dinner and had sent a voice note by mistake instead of a regular text. He had called instead of responding to it, and they had talked for 2 hours while she cooked and ate and washed up, and she had fallen asleep on her couch with the phone still in her hand, the call long since ended. He had not revealed more about his work than he had in the apartment. She had not pushed. She understood, in the way that people understand things about each other when they pay careful attention, that he was a man who guarded certain things deeply and that pressure in those directions would close doors rather than open them. She was patient. Patience was something nursing had given her in abundance. What she had noticed, gradually, was that he was funny, in the driest, most understated way imaginable, the kind of humor that arrived so quietly you sometimes only caught it a beat after it had passed, and then you laughed at the joke and at the delight of having found it. She had noticed that he thought carefully before he said almost anything, as though words were things he believed in using well. She had noticed that he asked about her rest, her meals, her cold walk home, with a frequency that was neither intrusive nor accidental. He was ensuring she was all right. She was not sure exactly when she had started noticing this clearly. But once she noticed it, she could not stop noticing it. On a late Friday night, after she had gotten home from a particularly hard shift, a shift that had involved the kind of loss that even 14 years of nursing did not make easy, she had texted him something simple, "Hard day." She had not wanted advice or solutions. She had simply needed to say it to someone who would receive it without making it more complicated than it was. He had replied, "I know." And then, after a brief pause, "Would you like company? I can talk or not talk. Either is fine." She had sat with that for a moment. Then she had called him. They had not talked. He had simply stayed on the phone with her while she made tea, and then while she sat in the quiet of her apartment, and he had said nothing and she had said nothing, and it had been the most comfortable silence she had experienced since her grandmother died. She had hung up 30 minutes later and said softly, "Thank you." He had said, "Anytime. Every time if you will let me." She had not answered that directly. But she had thought about it for a long time afterward. They met at a cafe on a Sunday afternoon, 6 weeks after the night in the snow. She had suggested it, a small place near her neighborhood that she liked because it was warm and unpretentious, the kind of place where the coffee was genuinely good and the chairs were comfortable enough to sit in for hours. She got there first and claimed a corner table, and she was reading a message from Marcus about his practice test scores when the door opened and Seo-jun walked in. She had not seen him upright and fully himself in daylight before. She had seen him in her apartment, pale and recovering. She had seen him in the gray morning light of his departure, coat on, composure reassembled. She had built a mental picture of him over 6 weeks of conversations, layering words and tone and the specific quality of his attention over the image she had formed in those first dark hours. The man who walked through the door of her neighborhood cafe was all of that, and also, disconcertingly, much more than she had allowed herself to fully register on the first night. He was tall enough that the room seemed aware of him. He moved with the contained, deliberate ease of someone who had never been unsure of where to put his feet, and he looked around the cafe with those dark eyes until they found her, and then something in the set of his face, subtly, in that specific way she had learned to read, changed. He came to the table. He sat across from her. He looked at the menu she handed him without looking at it. "You look well," he said. "So do you," she replied, and then, because this was who she was, added, "Much better than the last time I saw you in person." "The bar was low," he said. She grinned. "It really was." They ordered. They talked, the way they had been talking for weeks, easily overlapping with the comfortable rhythm of people who had already done the work of learning each other's conversational cadences and now simply enjoyed moving in them. But in person she noticed things that the phone had not conveyed. The way he watched her when she was talking. Not in the fixed, performative way of someone demonstrating that they were listening, but in the quiet, specific way of someone to whom the person in front of them is genuinely the most interesting thing in the room. It was, Tonia thought, a significant amount of attention from a man who looked like he rationed his attention as carefully as he rationed his words. At some point in the afternoon he told her more. Not everything. She understood that everything was not something that would come in a single conversation, or even in many, but more than before. He told her about growing up in Seoul, the youngest of a family where expectation was a language spoken more fluently than affection. He told her about the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who needed something from you constantly, without anyone ever asking what you needed yourself. He told her that the business he ran required a kind of vigilance that, over the years, had become indistinguishable from the way he moved through ordinary life, that he had forgotten, at some point, how to stop watching for what might go wrong and simply be present in what was actually happening. He said all of this quietly, without drama, in the way he said everything, as though each sentence had been considered for a long time before being released. And Tonia listened in the way she listened to everything important. Completely, without interrupting, without minimizing, without rushing towards solutions or silver linings. "The night in the storm," he said, looking at the cup between his hands. "I had been walking, not from anywhere, not toward anywhere. That is unusual for me. I have not done something without a destination in a very long time." He was quiet for a moment. "I think I was tired in a way I did not have a word for. The kind that sleep doesn't fix," she said softly. He looked up. "Yes," he said. "Exactly that." She nodded slowly. "I know that kind." "You should not know it," he said with sudden, quiet conviction. "You give out enough warmth to heat a city, Tonia. Someone should be ensuring that you do not run out of it." She looked at him across the cafe table, this man who had arrived in her life frozen and silent and needing to be saved, and who had spent 6 weeks since then finding every quiet, careful way he could to tell her that she mattered, and she felt something settle in her chest. Not quite arrival. Not quite certainty. But the particular stillness that precedes both. "I think you're doing a pretty good job of that," she said carefully. He held her gaze. "I intend to do a better one," he said. The afternoon light came through the cafe windows in long, pale bands, and somewhere across the room someone laughed at something, and the city moved around them in its usual unconcerned way, and Tonia thought about Mercy, about how it had started with her, a year ago in the snow, a reflex born from love and loss and every promise she had ever made, and how it had somehow come back to her in this form. A quiet, precise man who looked at her like she was the first warm thing he had encountered. After an exceptionally long winter. She did not say any of this out loud. Some things needed more time. But she thought it. She let it be true. 2 months after the night in the snow, Tonia Brooks's life had taken on a quality she could not quite identify at first. It was not dramatic. There were no grand gestures, no swept-off-her-feet moments. What there was, instead, was a persistent, gentle ease that she kept noticing in the corners of her days, the way you notice good lighting, Not because anything is announcing itself, but because everything simply looks a little better than it did before. The elevator in her building, which had been unreliable for 2 years, was quietly repaired. She assumed the management had finally gotten around to it. The streetlight on the corner of her block, which had been flickering for months and which she had reported to the city twice without result, was replaced one Tuesday morning while she was at work. She assumed the complaint had finally been processed. The new security camera at the entrance of her building, installed, the management informed residents as a routine upgrade, did not strike her as unusual. These things happened. She did not know that Kang Seo-jun had made a significant number of discreet calls regarding the precise quality of her commute, her building's infrastructure, and the general safety conditions of the 6-block radius around her home. She did not know that a small scholarship, anonymous and specifically targeted toward students at her community center who demonstrated exceptional academic merit and financial need, had been established at his direction, because she had mentioned Marcus 3 times in their conversations, and because Seo-jun understood from everything she had told him, that Marcus was the future she was investing her Saturdays in, and he saw no reason for a lack of resources to be the thing that slowed that future down. She did not know any of this with specificity, but she felt something. She felt it the way you feel a change in weather before it becomes visible, in the small, accumulating evidence of the world being slightly more manageable than it had recently been. At the community center, there was new equipment in the study room where she ran her Saturday sessions. Not announced, simply there, the staff uncertain of its origin. At the hospital, a notification appeared in the employee wellness system about a new parking subsidy program for night shift nursing staff. Whether Seo-jun had anything to do with this particular development was less clear, but the timing was, at minimum, interesting. What she did know, what she was fully and happily aware of, was that her phone had a message from him every morning when she woke up, and that his voice had become one of her favorite sounds, and that her kitchen felt different when she was dancing in it now because sometimes while she danced she imagined telling him about it afterward, and the imagining made her laugh in the specific way of a person who has found something genuinely worth keeping. They had dinner one evening at a quiet restaurant he had chosen, where the table was private and the food was extraordinary, and where he had ordered in Korean with a quiet word to the server that she did not catch, and then looked mildly alarmed by his own impulse when he noticed her watching him. "You like to take care of things?" she observed, not unkindly. "It is a flaw," he said. "No," she said. "It's not." She tilted her head slightly. "You just need to be sure the person you're taking care of actually wants to be taken care of. In the way you're doing the taking care. Does that make sense?" He considered this seriously, the way he considered everything seriously. "Yes," he said. "Do you?" She looked at him across the table, the candlelight making his dark eyes softer than usual, his expression as open as she had ever seen it, which was not very open at all by ordinary standards and was somehow still the most honest face in the room. "I'm not used to it," she said honestly. "But I think I'm learning to let you." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "That is enough. That is more than enough." And the quiet between them afterward was the kind of quiet that has finally stopped needing words to hold it together. Marcus, her Saturday student, got his test scores back on a Tuesday. He called her instead of texting, a sign she had learned to recognize as meaning the news was good enough to require a voice, and she stepped into the hallway at the hospital and listened to him tell her that he had scored high enough to qualify for 3 of the 5 programs he had applied to. She cried. Right there in the hallway, in her scrubs, with a paper cup of cold coffee in her hand, she cried with joy and pride and the particular relief of someone whose faith in a person has been confirmed. She told Seo-jun that evening. He was quiet on the phone for a moment and then he said, "You did that." "He did that," she corrected. "You gave him the Saturdays," he said. "You gave him the belief. Those are not small things, Tonia." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "You sound like you know what it feels like to not have those things." Pause. "Yes," he said quietly. "I do." She thought about him then, the younger version of him that he had only sketched for her in outline, the boy in soul who had grown up in a household that spoke expectation more fluently than warmth, who had built a life of extraordinary accomplishment and managed to leave no room in it for softness. She thought about what it costs a person to do that. What it costs to carry things alone for long enough. "You have them now," she said. "If you want them." He did not answer immediately. And then, "I want them." The second storm came in March. It arrived in the way March storms always arrived in Chicago, with a certain amount of arrogance, as though the calendar had given permission for winter to be over and the weather had decided to dispute the ruling. The forecast had mentioned it. The news had mentioned it. Tonia had mentioned it to herself that morning while looking out her window, noting the darkening sky and the rising wind with the resigned acceptance of a woman who had lived in this city long enough to know that it would do exactly what it pleased regardless of the date. She worked her shift. She came home. She made soup because soup was what you made when the weather was telling you to stay in and the radiator was doing its best. She called Marcus to check on his application paperwork. She texted her colleague Diane about a patient they were both monitoring. She danced briefly and poorly to an Al Green song while the soup simmered, because the day had been good and she was in that specific mood where joy insists on a physical expression. It was past 8 when her phone lit up with his name. She picked up immediately. "Hey, the storm." "I am outside," he said. She stopped. "You're outside my building?" "Yes." She crossed to the window. She looked down. There was a black SUV at the curb that she knew by now, had come to know the way you know the presence of something that has been consistently, quietly present in your world. And there, standing on the sidewalk beside it in his long charcoal coat, not moving toward the door, not calling up, just standing there in the swirling snow with his phone to his ear, was Kang Seo-jun. He was looking up. She could see the snowflakes landing in his dark hair. She could see his breath making small white clouds in the cold. She could see, even from 5 floors up, the particular quality of stillness that was uniquely his, not passive but present, the way still water is present, and the way his gaze found her window with the certainty of someone who had known exactly which one it was. "Seo-jun," she said. "It is snowing." "I am aware," he said. "You are standing in it." "I am," he agreed. She pressed her hand to her mouth for a moment, not laughing, or not only laughing. Something was happening in her chest that was bigger than laughter. "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of a man choosing words with his usual care, but also, she thought, of a man who was choosing to say something that lived outside his usual careful management of himself. "I wanted to come," he said finally. "I did not want to wait for a reason. I thought," another pause. "I thought that perhaps you should not have to wait either." She was already moving. She was already grabbing her keys from the hook by the door, pulling her grandmother's knitted hat over her coils, sliding her feet into the thick soled boots she kept by the entrance. She was at the elevator before she had consciously decided to go to him, which told her something about what her body understood that her thinking mind was still catching up to. The lobby. The door. The cold rush of the night. He was right there. He had crossed to the building's entrance and he was right there, and without the SUV's tinted glass between them or the small cafe table or the phone in each other's hands, he was simply a man standing in the snow looking at her with dark, quiet eyes that held something she had been watching grow for months, something patient and permanent and completely unafraid of itself. "You could come up," she said. "You know. Instead of standing in the storm." "I know," he said. And there was that expression again, the one that was not quite a smile but existed in the same vicinity, and that she had come to understand as one of the warmest things about him, because it was real in a way that many people's full smiles were not. "How long have you been down here?" she asked. "Not long," he said. Which she took to mean long enough. She looked at him, at this man who had arrived in her life frozen and unconscious and in need of saving, who had spent the subsequent months finding every quiet, deliberate way he could to ensure that the woman who had saved him was never cold, never alone, never carrying more than she needed to carry without someone alongside her. Who had made her life easier in ways she was still discovering. Who listened to everything she said with the full weight of his attention. Who had slowly, steadily, at the careful pace of someone who understood the value of what he was building, opened himself to her in return. She thought about Mercy. About how it had started on a freezing sidewalk in January, and how it had kept going, moving between them in both directions, turning into something neither of them had planned and both of them had needed. She stepped forward and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm now, entirely warm, and she felt him exhale. "Come upstairs," she said. "I made soup." "You made soup," he repeated, and in his voice was something she recognized as wonder. "Don't make it a big thing," she said, already pulling him toward the door. "It's just soup." But they both knew, as they stepped inside and the door closed behind them and the storm continued its business outside without them, that it was not just soup. It was the opposite of just soup. It was warmth offered and warmth received, it was a circle closed, it was two people who had started on a frozen sidewalk and arrived, through 9 months of small and patient and extraordinary things, at the inside of a door where the heat was on and the light was amber and the world felt, for the first time in a very long time for both of them, exactly the right size. He had come to her that first night needing to be kept alive. She had come to understand, slowly and then all at once, that he was doing the same for her, not in the clinical sense, not in the life-saving sense, but in the quieter, more essential sense of keeping a person's warmth alive when the world works constantly to diminish it. Upstairs, in the small kitchen that smelled like soup and the faint memory of Al Green, she handed him a bowl and sat across from him at the same small table where he had first eaten eggs in the morning light of an impossible night. He looked exactly right sitting there. He looked as though he had been finding his way back to this chair for a long time. He looked at her over the steam of his soup, and in his dark eyes she saw it, clear and complete and not hidden anymore. The obsession that had begun with a freezing night and a woman who refused to pass by. The quiet, unshakable certainty that she was the warmest thing he had ever been close to, and that he would spend the rest of his life making sure the world knew better than to try to take that warmth away. She saved his body on a Tuesday night in January. He spent the rest of his life saving her heart back. And that, in the end, is what mercy does when it is allowed to move freely between two people. It does not stay a single act of kindness. It becomes a whole life. It becomes everything. Thank you for watching until the very end. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that one act of kindness can change everything. Drop your city in the comments, and remember, the world always has room for one more Tonia.